All right, so get this. You've been deep diving into crypto lately, and we found a podcast episode that I think you'll find really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's called Crypto and Coffee at 8, and it's from December 18th, 2024.
Okay.
It covers all sorts of stuff, market trends, Bitcoin's performance, even some regulatory stuff. It's a lot to unpack.
Sounds like it. Where should we start?
Well, right off the bat, the host, George, he starts talking about these whales, like the big investors,
Right.
and he thinks they're manipulating the market. Like specifically, he mentions activity in whales right before the FOMC meeting.
Interesting. So he thinks these whales are trying to influence the outcome of the meeting.
That's what it sounds like. He suggests they're driving prices down to scare people into selling so they can buy back in cheap after the Fed makes their announcement.
That's a pretty bold claim. I mean, can a handful of big players really move the entire crypto market like that?
It's a good question, and honestly, it's hard to say for sure. But one of the research papers you sent over actually found a correlation between large sell orders and price drops.
Ah, so there's some evidence to support his theory.
Yeah, it seems like these whales might be exploiting something called stop-loss hunting. Basically, they push the price down far enough to trigger those automatic sell orders that a lot of people have set up.
And then they swoop in and buy up all that cheap crypto deal. Clever, but kind of sneaky, if you ask me.
Right. But the paper also mentioned that it's really hard to prove intent. Like these whales could always claim they were just reacting to market conditions.
Plus, with crypto exchanges being decentralized, it makes it even tougher to track these coordinated movements.
Exactly. So what does all this mean for the average person who's, just trying to navigate the crypto market?
Well, I think it reinforces the fact that volatility is a huge part of this space. And understanding those market dynamics is absolutely crucial.
So you're saying be prepared for sudden swings, especially around big events like the FOMC meeting.
Exactly. You don't want to get caught off guard.
Okay, good advice. Now let's talk about something a little more positive. This Bitcoin to gold ratio everyone's been buzzing about.
Ah, yes, that's been making headlines.
George, the podcast host, was practically giddy because it hit a new all-time high of 37.3. One Bitcoin is now worth more than 37 ounces of gold.
It's definitely a significant milestone.
He sees it as a sign that Bitcoin is on its way to becoming the ultimate store of value, like potentially even surpassing gold in the long run.
Well, it certainly sparked a heated debate, and the sources you sent over reflect both sides of the argument.
Oh, absolutely. You've got crypto enthusiasts who see this ratio as proof that Bitcoin is winning the race against gold.
They point to Bitcoin's limited supply and its decentralized nature as major advantages.
But then on the other hand, you've got gold bugs like Peter Schiff who think Bitcoin is a complete scam.
In fact, he even urged President Biden to sell off the government's Bitcoin holdings. He thinks it's just too risky.
And his reasoning, as he laid out in that op-ed you sent over, is basically that gold has a proven track record as a safe haven asset.
He argues that gold has intrinsic value, and it's held its own against inflation for centuries, while Bitcoin is purely speculative in his view and susceptible to manipulation.
It's a classic debate, old versus new tradition versus innovation.
Exactly. And it's a question that investors have been grappling with for years now. Could Bitcoin really replace gold as the king of safe haven assets?
It's the million-dollar question, right?
One of the historical analyses you included actually suggests that Bitcoin's price has become more closely correlated with gold's price, especially during times of economic uncertainty.
Oh, really? So that implies that investors might be starting to see Bitcoin as a digital equivalent to gold.
It's possible, but it's still too early to draw any definitive conclusions.
So what's the takeaway here? Should people ditch their gold and go all in on Bitcoin?
I wouldn't recommend making any rash decisions. Your investment strategy should always align with your individual goals, risk tolerance, and understanding of both assets.
That's a good point. Now, this next part gets really interesting. George brings up Tether, the company behind that big stablecoin USDT.
Oh yeah, Tether. What about them?
Well, apparently they've invested in a fully compliant European stablecoin called EURR.
Huh. That's interesting. Why would they do that?
That's what everyone's wondering. One of the crypto analysts you follow actually wrote a whole blog post about it, questioning Tether's motives.
Yeah, it does seem a little strange. Why invest in a competitor unless you're worried about your own compliance?
Right. George seemed to think it was a huge red flag, almost like Tether's trying to cover their tracks by backing a squeaky clean stablecoin.
It definitely raises some eyebrows, especially considering Tether's history with regulators. Remember this report from the financial watchdog that highlighted concerns about the transparency of Tether's reserves?
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal.
Mhm.
So should people be worried if they're holding USDT?
Well, the situation's still developing, and it's hard to say what the long-term implications will be.
So basically, stay tuned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Tether hasn't publicly addressed these concerns yet, but it's clear that regulators are watching them closely, particularly in Europe.
Speaking of regulatory crackdowns, let's shift gears and talk about what's happening in the UK.
Ah, yes. They're taking a much tougher stance on crypto these days.
It sounds like they're really trying to rein things in.
The Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, is proposing some pretty significant changes. They want to see more transparency and investor protection in the crypto space.
Do you think they're trying to prevent another FTX-style meltdown?
That's definitely part of it. The FCA is very concerned about the potential for fraud and market manipulation.
Makes sense.
But they're also trying to find that balance between fostering innovation and protecting consumers. It's a tricky tightrope to walk.
So what are they actually proposing? What would these new rules look like?
Well, for one thing, they want stricter requirements for crypto firms that operate in the UK. Things like enhanced due diligence on customers, more transparent reporting of reserves, and clearer risk warnings for investors.
It sounds like they're aiming to bring some order to what's often seen as the Wild West of finance.
Exactly. The FCA believes that stronger safeguards are needed to prevent market abuse and to protect investors, especially those who are new to crypto.
But won't these regulations stifle innovation? That's a concern I've heard a lot in the crypto community.
It's a valid concern. And the FCA acknowledges that they need to strike a balance. They're trying to create a regulatory framework that encourages responsible growth while safeguarding consumers.
But it's still early days, right? We don't know for sure what the long-term impact of these regulations will be.
Exactly. It's something we'll have to keep an eye on.
Okay, so we've talked about whales and market manipulation, the Bitcoin to gold debate, Tether's compliance issues, and now regulatory crackdowns in the UK. What's next?
Well, remember all that hype about the metaverse?
Yep.
It seems like Dubai is trying to revive it with a brand new platform.
They've teamed up with a company called Infinite Reality to create this platform that supposedly drives Web3 engagement.
It'll be interesting to see if they can pull it off.
Yeah, back in the Crypto and Coffee at 8 episode, George wasn't too impressed. He thinks just plopping existing systems into the metaverse is pointless. He wants to see a completely reimagined user experience.
He makes a good point. What's the point of the metaverse if it's not offering something truly unique and valuable?
Right. And there's some real challenges to overcome. A couple of the articles you sent over talked about how the technology just isn't quite there yet. We're still in the early awkward stages of virtual reality.
And then there's the issue of content. People need a compelling reason to spend time in the metaverse. It can't just be a digital copy of the real world.
So is the metaverse dream fading?
It's too early to say for sure, but the hype has definitely died down.
And now the focus is shifting towards building truly engaging and meaningful experiences.
Exactly. If the metaverse is going to succeed, it needs to offer something that we can't get anywhere else.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for a quick break. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still so much more to discuss.
I'm ready for part 2 when you are. So where were we?
We were talking about the metaverse and how it needs to find its killer app. You know, the thing that makes people go, I gotta be a part of this.
Ah, yes, the elusive killer app.
Speaking of game changers, remember that bombshell that George dropped in the Crypto and Coffee at 8 podcast?
You mean about President Trump creating that Doge department?
Yes. With Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy leading the charge, it sounds like something out of a movie.
It definitely caught my attention. And according to George, their mission is to explore getting rid of the Federal Reserve.
Wait a minute, are we talking about the Federal Reserve? The one that controls U.S. monetary policy?
Yep, that's the one. The one
Yeah.
that sets interest rates and basically influences the entire global economy.
I mean, before we write this off as completely crazy, there is that whole movement to audit the Fed, and some people even want to dismantle it altogether.
You're right, there's an article you sent that talked about that. It's definitely a fringe idea, but it's gaining traction in certain circles.
But what does this have to do with crypto? I'm not quite following.
Well, the article argued that cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin, are seen by some as a viable alternative to a centralized system controlled by institutions like the Fed.
So the idea is that a decentralized digital currency could be more transparent and less susceptible to government interference.
Exactly. It's about giving people more control over their own finances.
That's a pretty radical concept. I mean, could this Doge department actually pull it off?
It's highly unlikely, at least anytime soon. The Federal Reserve has been around for over a century. Dismantling it would have massive repercussions for the U.S. and the global economy.
Yeah, it would be a huge upheaval.
But I think this idea highlights a growing distrust of centralized institutions and a desire for alternative financial systems.
It's definitely food for thought. Even if it's just a hypothetical scenario, what would a world without the Fed even look like?
It's a question with no easy answers.
One of the sources you shared argued that it could lead to more economic freedom and innovation, but others worry about chaos and instability.
Right, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a study you sent that modeled the impact of a decentralized currency system on global trade.
And what did it find?
It suggested that it could actually reduce transaction costs and increase efficiency.
That's interesting. But
Yeah.
wouldn't it also create a ton of volatility?
Absolutely. The transition to a decentralized system would be a bumpy ride for sure.
So it's a trade-off. Potentially more freedom and efficiency, but also more risk.
Exactly. And it's a debate that's only going to intensify as the crypto landscape continues to evolve.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. We've gone from whales and Bitcoin versus gold to Tether's compliance issues and the UK's regulatory crackdown. And now we're talking about dismantling the Federal Reserve.
It's been quite the deep dive. And it just shows how transformative cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology could be. They're forcing us to rethink traditional systems and to explore new possibilities.
But it's important to remember that we're still in the early stages of this whole thing. There's a lot of uncertainty, volatility, and risk involved.
Got it. And that's why it's so crucial to stay informed. Be critical of what you hear and do your own research. Don't just blindly follow the hype or the fear-mongering.
Solid advice. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. From whale games and Bitcoin's rise to regulatory crackdowns and the future of the metaverse. We even touched on that radical idea of a world without the Federal Reserve.
It's fascinating to see how all these topics are interconnected. They paint a picture of a financial landscape that's rapidly changing, where old systems are being challenged and new possibilities are emerging.
And where does this leave our listeners in all of this?
That's the big question, isn't it? This deep dive has hopefully given you some valuable insights and perspectives to help you navigate this complex world.
But ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide how they want to engage with these ideas, whether you're a seasoned crypto investor or just starting to explore the possibilities.
Knowledge is power, especially in a space as dynamic and unpredictable as crypto. So keep learning, keep exploring, and keep those questions coming.
I love that. Keep those questions coming. All right. Well, this has been quite a journey, and I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, keep exploring the world of crypto. And until our next deep dive, happy crypto adventures. Wow. It's amazing how much we've covered in this deep dive.
It really is. We've gone deep on some pretty complex topics.
But you know what I keep thinking about? That Doge department that George mentioned in the Crypto and Coffee at 8 episode?
Yeah, the one with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy supposedly leading the charge to eliminate the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, that's the one. It just sounds so out there, you know?
It definitely does. But it also kind of reflects a growing sentiment among some people that the whole financial system needs a serious shakeup.
But could they actually eliminate the Fed? I mean, is that even possible?
Well, one of your sources, a white paper on monetary policy reform, argued that the Fed has way too much power and that it's not accountable enough to the people.
They also brought up concerns about inflation and the declining value of the dollar.
Right. And they proposed some alternatives like going back to the gold standard or adopting a decentralized digital currency.
So you're saying this Doge department could be a way to explore those options?
It's possible. It's important to remember that we're just speculating here. We don't really know what their goals are or how seriously they're taking this whole thing.
But even as a hypothetical scenario, it's pretty mind-blowing to think about.
For sure. What would it mean for the U.S. economy? For global markets? What would happen to crypto?
It's a lot to process.
One of the financial analysts you follow wrote a blog post predicting that getting rid of the Fed would probably cause a ton of volatility and uncertainty.
And they also suggested that it could benefit Bitcoin and other alternative currencies as people lose faith in the traditional system.
Yeah, that's a possibility. But there's also a huge downside to consider. Without a central bank to regulate monetary policy, we could see hyperinflation and economic collapse.
So it's like a high-stakes gamble with no guaranteed outcome.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be cautious and to consider all sides of the argument.
Well, this deep dive has given us a lot to chew on. We explored market manipulation, Bitcoin's rivalry, with gold Tether's compliance issues, and the UK's regulatory crackdown.
And then we went even further and explored the idea of a world without the Federal Reserve. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground, and I think it's safe to say that the crypto world is full of surprises.
Definitely. And the future is going to be even more unpredictable.
But that's also what makes it so exciting.
Right. It's a constantly evolving landscape full of possibilities.
So to all of our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of crypto.
Keep exploring, keep learning, and never stop asking questions.
That's the key. And until next time, happy crypto adventures, everyone.